World. I'm a shorter than average girl from down under, and today we're going to start on our deep dive into some of the complex theological and philosophical debates in the Muslim world, starting with
the final, glorious evolution.
Before we deep dive into this topic, I wanted to mention that the content in this video doesn't present the idea from a single school of thought, but multiple, highlighting the merits and the contentions associated with each. I have also done my best to exclude my personal biases and beliefs, hoping to provide a holistic view of all the sides of this discussion, rather than just answering the question based on what I agree with. This, however, is just the Muslim perspective on things, but of course, due to the origin of the modern interpretation of evolution from both Darwin and Wallace, who presented their ideas in a largely Christian society, it would be inaccurate to view this entire debate without its historical context, which means there will be a little bit of Christianity as well. However, the first thing that we've got to do is understand what evolution is. Evolution, by definition, is the process of characteristics changing over time. In the context of biology and speciation, it refers to the change in a species' characteristics over generations owing to how individuals thrive and through genetic mutation. The current mechanisms suggested for biological evolution have been seen within the observable record and are well founded in theory. But does this mean that these mechanisms were the same before the observable record? And do these mechanisms explain how all life came to be? Well, the universality principle, which is a key concept in rationalism, suggests that yes, the fundamental laws of nature, which we know today, existed before we knew them, in the same capacity and capability as they do now. For example, gravity existed before Newton discovered it, even though we only have a few recorded experiments before him. The same applies with evolution from a scientific standpoint. The math is mathing, and we have living species, paleontological, and archaeological pieces of evidence which aid the theory. But for some, this isn't convincing enough, because yes, there are still gaps in the prehistoric record, but you would expect that. When we take a deep dive into their understanding of evolution, we find that most of the issues with it doesn't come from the science, but its implication. If evolution was true, what would that mean for us as a species? And us as an intellectual being? The controversy of evolution doesn't come from the genetic research, the ecology, or studying fossils. It comes from the ideological warfare associated with it. So, let's get some context on how evolution came about and how itself evolved as a theory. The theory of evolution is commonly credited to the Victorian scientist Charles Darwin, and although Darwin's works, particularly The Origin of Species, is incredibly important to the development of the theory, it isn't the original conception of the idea that creatures change over time and pass these changes hereditally. Selective breeding has been a common practice for centuries before Darwin, a fact important to his works. And it was actually Lamarck who suggested that organisms are continuously adapting to a higher level of complexity via this inherent force. He also suggested that these adaptations can be passed from one generation to another. So it shouldn't have been too much of a surprise when two independent scientists in the mid-19th century came up with similar theories connecting different creatures together: Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. Wallace. Darwin entertained the thought after his voyage on the Beagle to the Galapagos Islands, whereas Wallace most notably his fieldwork in the Malay archipelago. Based on these similarities and the differences that they saw in the species, they stipulated that geographic barriers had caused these specimens to adopt different behaviors for survival, which ultimately led to these similarities diverging. Unlike Lamarck's theory, the divergence of traits brought forth the concept of a common ancestor in Darwin and Wallace's works. And this is really important because original propaganda against the theory commonly used this image for rage bait, essentially suggesting that we humans were apes. Now, some of you may be questioning why this would be so outrageous, but if you look back to 18th century thinking, the predominant belief on life in the Western world was something called the Great Chain of Being, essentially a hierarchy of existence, with common materials being the lowest on the list, and God, the most perfect being, on the top. Humans were above animals on the list, so suggesting that we came from them was an insult to our level of worth. And although this hierarchy may seem ridiculous to you now, its implications in our life from a moral standpoint are still ongoing. Why do we deem it okay to maim mountains for precious materials? Why do we cut down trees for lumber, food, and land? And why do we farm and keep animals as pets? This great chain of being has had a greater bearing of our understanding than ethics than we may have even considered. And as a consequence, it's given birth to activism, purpose, and responsibility. But it does not have a basis in biology. Instead, biology suggests that humans are superior as a product of environmental success, aka survival of the fittest. So going back to this image here, the reason why I'm calling it propaganda is because it misconstrues the theory of evolution. This image shows us Lamarckian evolution, creatures choosing to change gradually to achieve a more sophisticated form. It plays on humans' inherent sense of worth and entertains the idea of human superiority from the great chain of being. Instead, a common ancestor suggests that there was a group of individuals that were somehow separated, either due to travel, surviving some kind of colossal illness, or environmental event. These two separate groups can no longer come together. Now you've got a smaller gene pool on either side, or just the existing side if it was an event that wiped out part of the population. The things that the kids can now inherit from their parents are much less. And as they keep surviving, the individuals with better survival skills in this current situation are going to be more successful in procreating, therefore maintaining those successful traits for generations and generations. If by some chance you're able to bring back these two groups together, you'll find that they're completely different. And if attempts of procreating don't work, then they're considered two different species. And yes, I know just like anything in life, we have exception to these rules. As a consequence, we have things called hybrid species. But generally speaking, hybrid species are infertile in either one or both genders, which means that their parents still retain the title of being separate species, because it's not a successful and sustainable reproduction. But moving on, although Darwin's evolution gets around the controversial humans come from monkeys statement, it doesn't mean that it's controversy free. In fact, it poses a greater threat to theology than Lamarckian evolution does, which has been greatly used by atheists to nullify God's omnipotence. The process depends on natural factors, landmark events, and genetic mutations in individuals, a process which could be deemed as random. Every creature existing today appears to have come by chance. not intellectual design, which of course makes it a huge problem for religious communities if it is deemed true, which for those who take the words of Genesis quite literally, believe that animals and humans were made on the sixth day, so yes, it does pose a threat. However, for those of you who have watched my shifting sands analysis video, you'll remember that randomness doesn't mean without cause. It simply means without a visibly measurable cause. And so, we scientists use probability as a means of measuring outcome, given that the methodology is still a secret to our minds. In that way, Darwin's evolution doesn't contend with God, but it can be viewed as a natural law by which God created the world, just like gravity, just like relativity, and just like tectonic plates. Now, that's not to say that there aren't religious people, including Muslims, that still deny that evolution exists. There are, and they call themselves creationists. These people believe that God created each species individually and instantaneously. No evolution used. They do believe that individuals can choose to evolve to more sophisticated states in their lifetime, kind of like what Lamarck was suggesting, but instead of it being genetic, it's done through learning and mastering new skills, environmental factors like producing antibodies to fight diseases, and as a consequence of that, these can't be acquired inherently. The next generation could either receive them through their mothers via the placenta, which, I mean, with new research is also attributed to the father, but we're not going to get into that, and also through natural feeding. Not to mention, these things can be taught and passed down through education to the next generation. Creationists call this minor evolution, in contrast to Darwinism, which they call major evolution. So creationists believe in minor evolution, but not major evolution. But other than that, there are three schools of thoughts in the Muslim faith that accept the theory of evolution. The differences between these three come from what they do with us humans and the story of Adam and Eve. Because according to evolution, there is no place for the biblical or the Quranic account of Adam and Eve's conception. The first group are known as the human exceptionalists. They propose that every species came to be via evolution except humans. And this comes to somewhat the Islamic form of the Great Chain of Being. In Islam, every creation of God's is alive, which is different from the scientific definition of life, where only the five kingdoms are considered alive: animals, plants, fungi, protozoa, and bacteria. In Islam, as long as you have a form, it is living, contingent on the life of another, namely God al-Hayy al-Qayyum. However, some beings have the capability to make choices because they have souls. A plant soul gives it this innate drive to grow, seek resources, and procreate. An animal has the capability of the plant soul with the additional innate drive of observing and recalling and having emotions and desires. Now, humans have both the capacities of the plant and the animal soul, with the additional features such as the mind, external awareness, and therefore the capability of self-control. Now, this is a very oversimplified version of these complex topics, but the takeaway from all of this is, due to the additive nature of the soul, creatures of different soul types can evolve from one another. And this debate seems to be strongly emphasized between animals and humans, so I'm not entirely sure what human exceptionalist stance on plant to animal evolution is. But even so, going back to human exceptionalism, the easy thing about this theory is that evolution could have happened to every creature except humans, without it undermining God's omnipotence. And then God created Adam and Eve as the first humans, just as the basic version of the story goes. Capiche? There is one question that arises from this theory, though. How could all of humanity expand from one male and one female? And so this gets into another debate. There are some schools of thought that believe that the children of Adam and Eve interbred, but I mean, you can tell what I think about that theory. There is another theory that God sent other humans to Adam and Eve's children to expand the gene pool, and there are narrations to back this theory up, but depending on the person's school of thought, the chain of these sources may be considered illegitimate, making some Muslims believe that these narrations are authentic and others not. I'm telling you, there's this whole science behind this thing. But in terms of actual science, the second theory fits better because the DNA in the mitochondria of our cells can only be passed down maternally. And so far, variations in mitochondrial DNA have been so small that only 6 different mothers have been identified for the humans existing today. But it's still more than one female. And so now you've got our second group, the Adam Exceptionalists. This group believes that evolution happened, including humans. And then God decided to create Adam and Eve in the form of the most adapted and evolved animal species on Earth, Homo sapiens. Because unlike the biblical story, Muslims believe that Adam and Eve were destined to come to Earth, not a punishment. And I guess this is a good segue to say that next week's discussion is going to be about the Adam creation story. So if that is something that you're interested in, please do stay tuned to this channel. But anyways, after Adam and Eve came to Earth, they intermingled and their children eventually procreated with the existing humans living on Earth, which matches the scientific findings that Neanderthal and Denizen DNA exists in the genome of some ethnic groups. And this also doesn't contradict that previous narration that human exceptionalists believe in. But instead of it being some kind of miracle sent down humans from heaven, it is more one founded on divine intervention and divine action. The evidence that this group of Muslims use for their theory is the Quran itself. God uses 2 different words referring to humans, bashar and insan. However, these are not used interchangeably. The word bashar is only used when referring to humans' physical appearances or characteristics, such as بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قالت أنى يكون لي غلاما ولم يمسسني بشر ولم أك بغيا وقلنا حاش لله ما هذا بشرا إن هذا إلا ملك كريم وما أنت إلا بشر مثلنا وإن ظنك لمن الكاذبين ومن آياته أن خلقكم من تراب ثم إذا أنتم بشر تنتشرون. However, when speaking about the conduct and purpose of humans, God uses the term insan or its plural, ins. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ إِحْسَانًا إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ على السماوات والأرض والجبال فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقن منها وحملها الإنسان إنه كان ظلوما جهولا. Not to mention, when God talks about the creation of humans, he only uses the term insan. وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانِ مِنْ صَلْصَالٍ خلق الإنسان من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين الذي أحسن كل شيء خلقه وبدأ خلق الإنسان من طين لقد خلقنا الإنسان في أحسن تقويم. This group suggests that the term bashar refers to Homo sapiens, or the animal form or body that we humans have, whereas the term insan refers to us humans, the children of Adam and Eve. This means that they claim that our predecessors, Adam and Eve, were not made through evolution, but were given bodies of Homo sapiens after Homo sapiens existed, and that the continuation of the line of Homo sapiens, if you like, is the same method of procreation that animals would use. Now, this does suggest one important thing, that Homo sapiens are the final evolution of animals in this world, if you like, and that any future evolution will be that of the human. But unfortunately, we haven't gone long enough to ever see this happening. There's a lot to talk about with this one, but unfortunately, it's strongly tied to the Adam creation story, which is outside of the scope of today's video. But as we talked about before, it is going to be next week's topic, so save your questions till then. Now, your final group is your evolutionists. They believe that everything came via evolution. No exceptions. And the entirety of the Adam and Eve story represents something metaphorical or metaphysical. Creation doesn't have to be instantaneous. Science and religion don't have to match, given one is meant to be an explanation of life and the other a guide to it. And some even go as far as saying that Adam and Eve never existed. It was just a story for us to learn from. But of course, there are others that say no, Adam and Eve did exist. However, they both had parents, like we all do. The difference is that they raised themselves, and God sent to them the first revelation or guide, thus, spiritually speaking, made them the first humans of our generation, the God-conscious ones. There are also people in this camp which tie this entire Adam and Eve being the first to the soul argument. They say that Adam and Eve were the first humans because they were the first Homo sapiens to be born with a human soul, not just a plant and an animal one. To aid this theory, they too use the distinction between Bashar and Insan in the Quran to justify their thoughts. So essentially, the major differences between this group and the Adam Exceptionalists are what they believe the Adam and Eve story really means. Now, in the broader context of Islamic thinking, the idea of change due to the environment was well founded from the beginning. From the golden age of Islam, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, Rumi's poetry, and the works of Al-Ghazali were only a few examples of this on display. However, it must be noted that the evolution mentioned in these writings were specifically referencing the soul, not the physical body. They are philosophical and spiritual transformations, akin to those presented in ancient Greek and Eastern philosophies. And the reason why I wanted to highlight this last is because there are a few contemporary scholars of historical Islamic texts which use these particular pieces, among others from the Golden Age, to suggest that medieval Muslims believed in biological evolution, and that Muslims in today's day and age have actually gone backwards over the centuries. In the years after Revelation, particularly during the Abbasid Caliphate, there was a boom of intellectual and scientific discussion in a myriad of different subjects, including biology and philosophy. And so some of these authors, they wrote about these two different subjects, but it doesn't mean that we should mash up their works together to try and form a coherent story which aids our initial premise. I found this thesis called Islam and Evolution by Shu'aib Ahmed Malik after I completed my research for this video. But for anyone who wants more information and an in-depth look at the different schools of thought and textual interpretations, I highly recommend this work. It does a phenomenal job in synthesizing this topic. It does predominantly use Sunni sources, mostly focusing on the Ash'ari school of thought, but I think that regardless of your beliefs, there is a lot about the history of evolution and the interpretations of historical texts which you'd find interesting. Like, I'm not even of the Ash'ari school of thought, but I still thought this was a great synthesis of the topic. And besides, it's not your school of thought that defines your belief. We are more than capable of learning a plethora of knowledge and then sifting through it to see what resonates with us. Like, I'm a huge fan of many of the ancient scholars mentioned in this book, and completely understand how important their works have been to the modern debates. I also learned about people that I never knew before, like Ikhwan al-Safa, so that was pretty cool too. If you really want a deeper dive into the topic of evolution in Islam, I highly recommend checking out this thesis. But just to summarize what we've been discussing, when it comes to evolution, Muslims can fall under 4 different opinions. Number 1, that evolution didn't happen and God created everything the way that it is. Number 2, evolution is absolutely valid and non-contradictory with God's capabilities, and that the story of Adam and Eve is purely metaphorical or metaphysical. Number 3, evolution is based, except for humans coming from it, because humans have this additional power or soul which makes them a higher level than the animals. And 4, evolution is totally cool. It's basically the way which led God to choose the animal Homo sapiens to be the chosen vessel for his creation that he called humans, and so created Adam and Eve to look like Homo sapiens, with the ability to procreate just like them, and so introduced a non-animal creation with an animal body to the material world. Next week, we're going to be looking at the story of Adam and Eve, how it differs from the Bible, and some of the deeper interpretations and implications of the story on us as humans in the 21st century. So I hope you learned something today and enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving this video a like and sticking around for more content like this by a little subscribe. Feel free to share this video with anyone who'd be interested in learning about the Islamic view on
Evolution.
and have a lovely day. Be brave, be happy, and be kind, and we'll catch you all next time.